This is really interesting. I don't know anybody else really that does this. So, can you give me some background on how you got started taking photos of high water in Charleston?
Yeah, so I'm a civil engineer by education and background and profession, and have spent most of my career in Charleston working in water resources, flood mitigation, and over really the past 8 or so years, really a focus and passion for flood resilience as we look at changing rainfall patterns and sea level rise and climate change. It was kind of the intersection of working on some large drainage projects for the city of Charleston years ago, being out observing. It happened to be, oh gosh, I think it was September of 2015. So right before the October 2015 thousand-year flood event that everybody remembers. And we had some king tides, and I was taking pictures of them for a work project, not so much for a personal project. And then it all just kind of intersected, and the cross section of photography, along with my background as an engineer, led to kind of documenting the different types of flooding we see, why I think it's important. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of people don't understand the differences between the different types of flood events we see. So that's kind of one of the reasons that I started the project. And then in 2020, I had so many different photos of flooding and different events, and in the middle of the pandemic where you found more time to do things that you didn't have before, I decided to pull it together in a project, and have been pretty blown away by the response that I've gotten to it.
Yeah, it's kind of a different kind of storm chasing, but it's certainly just as dangerous. So, can you take me through the process of how you actually maneuver through high water to take these photos?
It's funny you say that. I get a lot of people that are like, "Oh, Jared's a storm chaser," and I guess first thing I would say is if there was ever an evacuation order or something called in place, I would most likely heed the evacuation order and not be out taking the photos. I've been fortunate to know some people that have given me rides or let me tag along and see some things. A photo I had of Irma back in 2017 was really the only photo I would say that I've ever truly gone viral. It was used on the Weather Channel, and it's water on both sides of the battery, and so that one kind of took a life of its own. But it also, I think, gave me the flood photographer reputation that I have here locally. But I try to be safe. I will say this past time, last Wednesday, I was trying to be safe. I have waders on. I was actually on a bicycle. Um, and there was a moment when I was leaving my house to go down. It was as the surge was really starting to come in that the gust of wind came through, and I was like, maybe this isn't the safest idea. Maybe this isn't the best idea. And I was like, let's be safe and make it through. And luckily, the wind never really picked up more, and that was one of the only really rough gusts I saw where I really felt unsafe. But I try to be safe, as safe as I possibly can.
Yeah, speaking of last week, can you talk about Idalia? Because this was a one for the record books as far as storm surge in Charleston with the tide, with the rain, with the storm coming in. So, can you tell me what that was like being out in it and how it compares to some of the past events you've covered?
You know, it's funny. I said referenced Irma, and Irma got probably about 8 or 9 inches higher than Adelia got. Um, and I was out photographing it, but at the peak of Irma's surge, I was sheltering in place in a parking garage because there was a tornado warning. And so actually got stuck in the garage because the surge came in and surrounded the garage that time. But so around town and down in the battery in those areas, I never actually saw the water as high as I saw it last Wednesday. It's the fifth highest tide we've ever seen. Almost, it was within an inch, I think, of Hurricane Matthew's surge back in 2016. Um, and it was seeing water in places that you're not used to seeing water. I mean, you're used to seeing it on the battery. You're used to the flooding down in south of Broad where we filled in the creeks. But seeing it in some other areas, kind of on the Upper Peninsula and Morrison Drive, and overtopping berms that had been built to try to keep the higher king tides out, just seeing that volume of water come in and kind of surround places that you normally see dry is pretty wild.
So I'm curious, you're an engineer, you're working on some solutions here. How do you balance this, what you're seeing and what your day job is? Does what you see in the evening when you go out and shoot high water affect what you're doing at work?
Yeah, it definitely informs, I think, how I look at it and how I think about what we can do at it. I'm not actually working on any projects in Charleston right now locally that are working to address it. Um, but I think you can keep the water out to a certain point, and I think we need to be exploring that. But I think you also need to look at ways. I mean, we filled so many creeks on the peninsula that when it rains, not tidal flooding, when it rains, it also floods in those areas. And so looking at ways to sustainably and resiliently manage the water kind of inside whatever you build to keep the water out. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You don't want to build a bathtub that's going to flood when it rains just to keep the tides out. So it's kind of balancing that pattern. And I think that's what you're seeing people, a lot of coastal communities kind of fight and deal with.
Well, speaking of other communities, do you ever go to other cities to shoot?
I have not, just out of convenience. I mean, if I was somewhere and it was flooding, again, I guess I just like to. I don't consider myself a storm chaser or one of those freelance meteorologists that goes out and does the chasing. I have seen them, especially last year when we had Ian coming in. That's not me, but I do think I do enjoy going out. I mean, I like documenting and see what it is, and I do. I think I learn something every time I'm out.
Do you think you'll stick with flooding, or do you think you'll ever maybe shoot up to the clouds or pick something else up as far as natural disasters?
I haven't planned on going anywhere else other than flooding, or really just kind of what we're fighting here in Charleston. If I moved somewhere else and it was some sort of other problem, maybe I would. But
what's interesting about your pictures too is that they're so impactful, but they're also really beautiful, which then, I look at them and I think, well, I feel bad that I think this is really a beautiful picture because this is destruction happening. So you're really on the front lines of seeing this, how this impacts communities and people. And what are you seeing when you shoot? Do you ever shoot people and their reaction to flooding, or do you stick with mostly the water itself?
I have mostly stuck to the water itself. There was a time, it was a stormwater flood about 2 years ago, so just a random summer afternoon and a big heavy rain we got. And I was over on the west side near Gadsden Green, and the streets were flooded, and a big truck came plowing through and sent a big wake, and it's coming in people's front doors and going into their cars. And I talked to a gentleman that had lived there for, I don't know, probably 20 or 25 years, and he was just complaining about the lack of progress and the police not closing the streets and allowing people to drive through them. And I do think that there is a really interesting social dynamic I would like to try to capture. I'm not a journalist though either, so I think that would be teaming with somebody that helped me along the way. But I would like to capture more of the human aspect and the impacts of this.
I think you are a journalist. But,
thank you.
All right, last question. So weather and photography and storm chasers and pictures, there's been a little bit of controversy lately on social media because every once in a while a picture will pop up that is clearly, to me, AI generated and but not clear to everyone who perhaps isn't a meteorologist or an expert. And I noticed that you've been dabbling a little bit in seeing what AI can create when it comes to flooding photography. Can you give me your 2 cents on the role of AI when it comes to these images that are generated?
I'm really not sure what the role is yet. I do think that there's definitely, and playing around with it, and I am nowhere near an expert in AI image generation. But I think as we look at solutions and what solutions could look like in the built environment, I do think there's a really unique opportunity there to use it to our advantage and quickly generate some visuals. Obviously, there's the sinister side of it that could present things that don't happen. I mean, the one that you think about all the time is the sharks or the alligators swimming in waters that are flooded that you see every time a hurricane comes through.
Yes.
AI to me and my dabblings with it's not necessarily, it knows what Charleston is and what Charleston looks like, or it's supposed to look like, but it doesn't know actual locations. It doesn't know real places. And there's certainly ways that you could teach it what those places are and it could envision it, but I haven't gotten to that point. I'm not sure that I will. I do think from a narrative standpoint, though, going back to a narrative, I think there's ways that you could create things that are AI, make sure that the audience understands that it's AI, but also that have some I don't know if shock value is the right angle that I'm looking for, but that make people think more in depth about what's going on and what can be done about it.